On November 7, 1983, NATO launched a military exercise across Western Europe. It was called Able Archer 83. It was designed to simulate, in realistic detail, the final stages of a conventional war, escalating into a nuclear exchange between NATO and the Soviet Union. It was a drill. Everyone on the NATO side knew it was a drill. The Soviet Union knew NATO was conducting an exercise. What Soviet leaders feared was that the exercise might be concealing preparations for a real nuclear first strike. Soviet intelligence watching the exercise unfold, the new communication formats, the radio silences, the movement of forces through escalating alert levels, the realistic dummy nuclear warheads being loaded onto aircraft at NATO bases, concluded that what they were watching might be the final preparations for a real attack. Aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons were placed on heightened readiness at Soviet bases in East Germany. The Soviet military command began making preparations that would allow it to retaliate or preempt a NATO attack. On November 11th, Able Archer 83 ended. The Soviets stood down. The crisis, if it can be called that, given that almost nobody in the West knew it had happened, was over. The President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board later assessed that in 1983, the United States had inadvertently placed its relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger, and almost nobody had noticed. To understand why a NATO exercise could bring the Soviet Union to the brink of a nuclear response, you have to understand what 1983 actually looked like from Moscow. By the early 1980s, Soviet leadership was aging, paranoid, and increasingly convinced that the United States was preparing for a surprise nuclear attack. Yuri Andropov, who became General Secretary in November 1982, following Brezhnev's death, had spent much of his career at the KGB and viewed the world through the lens of intelligence and counterintelligence. He was not inclined to give the United States the benefit of the doubt. Reagan's rhetoric did nothing to reassure him. In March 1983, Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system the Soviets interpreted not as a defensive measure, but as a shield that would allow the United States to launch a first strike without fear of retaliation. From Moscow's perspective, the Strategic Defense Initiative was an offensive weapon dressed as a defensive one. NATO was simultaneously deploying new intermediate-range Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, missiles that could reach Moscow in under 10 minutes. For Soviet planners accustomed to having at least a few minutes of warning before incoming missiles arrived, the Pershing II compressed the decision window to almost nothing. Soviet intelligence had launched Operation Ryan, from the Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack, a worldwide intelligence gathering effort specifically designed to detect signs that the United States was preparing a nuclear first strike. KGB operatives across Europe were instructed to monitor everything from troop movements and government communications to blood bank activity and the lights in government buildings at night. The system was primed to interpret ambiguous information as evidence of the attack it feared. Then, on September 1st, 1983, Soviet Air Defense Forces shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian airliner that had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people on board. Reagan called it a massacre. The international reaction was fury. Relations between Washington and Moscow deteriorated sharply. And 11 days after the Petrov incident, the false alarm on September 26th, that Stanislav Petrov had declined to report up the chain of command, NATO began Able Archer 83. Able Archer was an annual NATO exercise. The Soviets knew it happened every year. What made the 1983 version different was a series of changes that in isolation might have seemed routine, but in combination and in the context of everything else happening in 1983, looked to Soviet observers like something else entirely. The 1983 exercise introduced new, unique formats of coded communication that Soviet signals intelligence had not seen before. It featured extended periods of radio silence, unusual for an exercise, but consistent with what one might expect in the final hours before a real attack, when communications security becomes paramount. Unlike previous years, where NATO forces remained at a constant alert level throughout the exercise, the 1983 version simulated a realistic escalation through multiple alert levels, culminating in the simulated release of nuclear weapons. Most alarmingly, some NATO aircraft practiced nuclear warhead handling procedures, including taxiing out of hangars carrying realistic-looking dummy warheads. To a Soviet intelligence officer watching through binoculars or via satellite imagery, the distinction between a dummy warhead and a real one was not obvious. The exercise also involved heads of state in a way that previous exercises had not. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl participated. To Soviet analysts trained to watch for signs of political preparation for war, the involvement of national leaders in a military exercise was a significant indicator. KGB stations across Western Europe filed urgent intelligence reports. Moscow sent flash telegrams to residencies, ordering immediate assessment of NATO military activity. The assessment that came back was alarming. What was happening looked, in several key respects, like what a real attack might look like. Aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons at Soviet bases in East Germany were placed on heightened readiness. The Soviet military command began preparations that would allow it to respond to a NATO strike without delay. The Soviet reaction was deliberately kept secret. An open mobilization, Soviet commanders reasoned, might itself provoke a Western response. And if NATO was indeed preparing an attack, advertising that the Soviets knew about it might accelerate rather than deter it. So the preparations were made quietly, in ways designed to be detectable by Western intelligence only with difficulty. What resolved the situation was a combination of factors, none of them planned. First, the exercise ended on schedule, on November 11th. When NATO forces stood down, the threat signature that Soviet intelligence had been tracking simply disappeared. The pattern that had looked like preparation for an attack turned out to be a training exercise, exactly as NATO had said it was. Second, a British intelligence officer named Oleg Gordievsky, who was secretly working as a double agent for British intelligence, had been reporting on Soviet concerns about the exercise in real time. His reports, reaching the British government during the exercise, conveyed the genuine alarm in Moscow in a way that allowed Western officials to understand for the first time that their drill had been misread as something far more dangerous. Third, an American Air Force general named Leonard Perroots, watching the unusual Soviet military activity during the exercise, made a quiet decision not to place NATO forces on increased alert in response. His reasoning? Wait and see whether the Soviet behavior was caused by the exercise itself. By not mirroring Soviet preparations, he avoided a feedback loop that might have escalated into something real. When President Reagan was briefed on what the Soviets had believed during Able Archer 83, largely through Gordievsky's intelligence, his reaction was genuine surprise. He wrote in his diary in November 1983, "I feel the Soviets are so defense-minded, so paranoid about being attacked, that without in any way being soft on them, we ought to tell them no one here has any intention of doing anything like that." The Able Archer experience contributed to a shift in Reagan's thinking about the Soviet Union. Not a softening of his opposition to Soviet power, but a growing recognition that Soviet leaders were genuinely afraid, not merely posturing, and that American military exercises and rhetoric were being interpreted in Moscow in ways Washington had not intended or understood. This shift contributed, in ways that historians are still debating, to the change in tone in American-Soviet relations that preceded the arms control agreements of the mid-1980s. Whether Able Archer was a direct cause of that change or simply one of several factors remains contested. What is clear is that it was one of the moments when both sides came closest to a nuclear confrontation that neither wanted, and that the closeness of that call was not understood in the West until years later. The Able Archer incident reveals something that the standard histories of the Cold War have consistently underemphasized. The danger was not only in the decisions of leaders. It was also in the systems those leaders had built, the intelligence systems, the alert systems, the military exercises, that could interact with each other in ways nobody had fully anticipated. The Soviet early warning system, primed by Operation Ryan to find evidence of an imminent attack, was remarkably good at finding that evidence, whether it was there or not. The signals it read during Able Archer 83 were real. The communications were unusual. The alert levels were escalating. The warhead handling procedures were being practiced. The problem was that all of these things were happening because it was a training exercise, not because an attack was coming. And in a world where one side's training exercise can look indistinguishable from the other side's attack preparations, the margin between war and peace often depends not on rational decision-making, but on whether the exercise happens to end before anyone fires. Able Archer 83 lasted 5 days. During those 5 days, Soviet forces were placed on a level of readiness that had not been seen in peacetime. Soviet leaders feared, for some portion of those 5 days, that they might be watching the final preparations for a nuclear war. They were watching a training exercise. Nobody was killed, no missile was launched. The exercise ended on schedule, the alert stood down, and the world continued exactly as it had been before November 7th. But the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, reviewing the classified intelligence 2 years later, assessed what had happened in a way that has never been fully absorbed into the public understanding of the Cold War. In 1983, it said the United States had inadvertently placed its relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger. The trigger was not pulled, but the finger was there.